Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Durgesh.
ఎలా ఉన్నారు మేడం? మంచి ఊరికి వెళ్ళి వచ్చారు అనుకుంటా.
ఊరెళ్ళాను, ఫీవర్, కొంచెం థ్రోట్ ఇన్ఫెక్షన్ ఉంది.
అందుకంటే డల్ గా ఉన్నారు మేడం.
రోజు కొంచెం అడ్జస్ట్ చేసుకోండి, ఓకేనా?
అయ్యో మేడం, పర్లేదు మేడం, మీకు హెల్త్ బాగాలేకపోతే
కొంచెం బాగా పెయిన్ ఉంది నాకు.
అయ్యో,
వాటర్ వల్ల వెళ్ళాను కదా.
ఇట్స్ ఓకే మ్యామ్, మీ హెల్త్ బాగాలేకపోతే ఇట్స్ ఓకే మ్యామ్, విల్ టేక్ సార్.
పర్వాలే, ఏం కాదు. నిన్ననే చెప్పలేదు కదా, ఈరోజు కొంచెం చెప్తాను. ఇది ఇప్పుడు చెప్పేస్తాను క్యూటో ప్రోటోకాల్. నెక్స్ట్ క్లాస్ అది కూడా 14 స్లైడ్స్ ఉన్నాయి. ఈరోజు తొందరనే కంప్లీట్ చేస్తాను.
ఓకే మ్యామ్.
అందరు వచ్చారా? ఎంతమంది? 9 మెంబర్స్ ఉన్నారు. 2 minutes వెయిట్ చేస్తాను. ఏం చేస్తున్నారా?
Ma'am, why are you not starting?
Ma'am, start, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Okay, today topic is Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so I already told about it. So what is the difference between Montreal Protocol and Kyoto Protocol? Anybody? Yeah, okay. So I will tell you, no problem. So there is difference between Montreal and Protocol. So while the Montreal Protocol was established to phase out substances, right? So that deplete ozone. So then this Kyoto Protocol was set in place to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, right? Greenhouse. Okay, greenhouse gases. Right? So with the exception into ozone depleting substances, that is called ODP, right? So this Kyoto Protocol is an agreement signed as part of the UNFCCC. What does that means? UNFCCC. So this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? So the UNFCCC in the year of 1992, a major environment related summit. It was held called the Rio, right? So Rio Earth Summit. You see here Rio, okay? Rio Earth Summit. So this is the landmark summit in the field of environment, climate change, and biodiversity conversation. So because at the Rio Summit, all the countries, they came together, right? And they worked out several important agreements and conventions, which were designed to protect our environment, right? So that is when we, in Framework Convention on the Climate Change, it was brought out for the first time the world was talking climate change seriously, and global efforts were in tackle the threat posed by climate change and global warming. Along with that, the Convention of Biological Diversity, it was also adapted to conserve and protect our biodiversity. Even the UNC, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, it was also adapted to tackle the threat of soil degradation and desertification. So this Rio Earth Summit, it was a landmark event that gave so that gave birth to important conventions, international conventions in the field of environment and also biodiversity protection. So one of the most important convention, it was the UNFCCC. So that was a dedicated platform to fight the climate change, right? So every year from this 1992, the Conference of Parties, it will be held under this UNFCCC. The countries around the world, all these United Nations, UN members, they would come together at the Conference of Parties and discuss ways and measures to tackle the threat posed by climate change. Because by now climate science had evolved. So scientific evidence had emerged. So these greenhouse gas emissions, which were a result of our industrial agricultural activities. So they were directly responsible for rising temperatures, so that we refer to as global warming, right? So as you know, greenhouse gases, what are the greenhouse gases? Like carbon dioxide, methane, etc., right? So they trap more heat in the atmosphere. All of you know about this. And thereby directly contribute to the heating of the atmosphere. So in general, we refer to this phenomena as global warming, right? So see, global warming does take place naturally as well, but anthropogenic activities. So that is human activities, right? So it has accelerated global warming. So, and deforestation and also industrial development and industrial activities, right? And emissions from vehicles and industries, they have all contributed to increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? So thereby dropping more heat and triggering global warming around the world. So since climate science was evolving and scientific evidence was being thrown out by institutions like IPCC. All of you know this IPCC. What is this IPCC? Anybody tell me IPCC? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? IPCC, it stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it was conclusively being proven that only human activities, right? So were directly responsible for global warming and climate change. So finally, under the this UN Convention, climate change countries, they started acting together. They started working together. And they would meet at the Conference of Parties every year. So the idea was to work out a way that is through which the emissions could be brought down. So through which emissions intensity could be brought down, so that we can tackle global warming and climate change in the long term, right? So under this convention, under the UN Framework Convention and Climate Change, after a few years of negotiations in the 1997, right, is a very important agreement was worked out, that is known as the Kyoto Protocol, right? So it was signed in the year of 1997 when the Conference of Parties was held at Kyoto. Kyoto means which is a city in the Japan, right? So this is the city name, Kyoto. So this happened to be the first major agreement, a binding agreement. So that was signed under the climate, right? Climate change convention. So it was signed 5 years after the climate change convention. It was launched in the 1997. So this was the first binding agreement that was signed under the climate change convention, right? So this is referred to as the Kyoto Protocol. And 192, you see here 192 countries, almost every country in the world, almost every Indian member signed and ratified in this convention. So however, Canada, right? So Canada did withdraw later. So but that is a later development. So Canada withdrew from Kyoto Protocol in the year of December 2012, right? So few countries have not ratified it all, like United States. So for example, the US, it was part of the negotiations, but it never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, right? So let's understand a little more about this important agreement that is related to climate change and global warming, right? So, see, under this Kyoto Protocol, the greenhouse gases which had to, that is to be targeted or identified. So that is something that is unique about this Kyoto Protocol. So it was a very specific agreement which had specific provisions on how to tackle the threat posed by climate change. So this is protocol identified, right? So specific greenhouse gases, these are the greenhouse gases, right? So that was directly responsible for global warming. So this was based on scientific evidence, based on climate science, right? So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. So these dangerous gases, they were identified, their contribution to global warming are exactly quantified, and it was brought out through a index known as the global warming potential. So the global warming potential, that is called, I already told about this global warming potential, GWP, right? So this global warming potential of a greenhouse gases indicates the ability of this gas to contribute to global warming. These gases contribute to global warming. So these greenhouse gases have tremendous potential to cause global warming, right? So that is to determine the global warming potential. Carbon dioxide is taken as the reference. CO2. So why? So carbon dioxide is the reference. So that is why the global warming potential for carbon dioxide is how much? 1. Right? So using carbon dioxide as reference, the ability to cause or contribute to global warming from other gases is calculated and quantified. So based on that, it is said that methane, it contributes 21 times. You see here, 21 times more than CO2, carbon dioxide, to global warming, right? So similarly, NO2, HFCs, PFCs. So all these, they are contribute many times more than this carbon dioxide does to global warming, right? So 1 ton of methane, it will be how much? 21 times more deadlier. It will be more prone to capture heat as compared to 1 ton of carbon dioxide, right? You see here nitrous oxide. How much nitrous oxide?
310 times, ma'am.
Times more potent, right? So when it comes to capturing heat and retaining heat, and hydrofluorocarbons and these perfluorocarbons are also thousands, you see here, right? So thousands of times more potent, and most potent is SF6, sulfur hexafluoride. So which is nearly 24,000 times, right? 24,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So when it comes to capturing heat in the atmosphere, right? So actually the most prominent greenhouse gas, that is carbon dioxide, followed by methane and other greenhouse gases, which have a very high global warming potential. Their concentration level is less. So as a result, they don't contribute much to global warming as much as carbon dioxide and methane. So it's mainly because of the volume and distribution in the atmosphere. But nevertheless, all these are major greenhouse gases which significantly contribute to global warming, right? So these greenhouse gases were specifically identified in Kyoto Protocol. Their sources of emissions, it was also identified, right? So what sources are contributing to these emissions? So based on this is a plan, it was worked out, a strategy was, it was brought out which would place binding targets on certain countries, that is to bring down the emissions of these greenhouse gases. Okay? So remember the greenhouse gases that were identified by protocol. So their global warming potential and the sources of the emissions, right? So based on this Kyoto Protocol, provided for operationalizing the climate change convention, right? So it placed the primary responsibility on industrialized, right? Industrialized countries, right? And economies in transition. So which were mainly responsible for historical emissions, right? So the developed countries, industrialized nations, the Western countries, in particularly European countries, the few industrialized nations and economies in transition. So these countries were identified, they were placed under a separate category. So a separate annex. So I told you what is the annex, and they were given a separate set of responsibilities. Right? So the primary principle of Kyoto Protocol is CBDR. CBDR. So what is this CBDR? So this is the underlying principle of Kyoto Protocol. So it stands for common but differentiated responsibilities. Right? Common but differentiated responsibilities. So this principle was mainly pushed by developing nations led by India and even by China. Right? India and China. China. Right? So you see this, where you need to understand that at climate change negotiations. So there has always been a divide, there has always been a conflict between the developed countries and the developing and undeveloped nations. So developed countries have always been on one side, they have a different argument, and in developing nations. So it has been on the other side of the conflict along with the developed countries, right? So, and also least developed countries and small islands states. So they have all been on the one side opposite the policies and initiatives of developed nations. So what is this divide all about? See, when it comes to climate change, greenhouse gases have been emitted into the atmosphere, right? So since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so what is the time period Industrial Revolution? Industrial Revolution, I already told about this Industrial Revolution in C6 paper. Beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what is the time period? 19?
Early 18th century, ma'am.
Yes?
Early 18th century, ma'am.
I can't listen your voice. Speak loudly.
1820 to 1840, ma'am.
Yes, right. Right? So that is when the humans started burning fossil fuels in large quantities. So that is when agriculture started expanding, industrial activities expanded and deforestation increased. We were destroying natural carbon sinks. So we were extracting fossil fuels. So that is crude oil and gas, burning them to power our industries and also vehicle transportations, etc. Right? So from late 1700s and early 1800s is when we started releasing greenhouse gases in large quantities when industrial revolution happened in Europe. Massive amount of greenhouse gases were released, and these countries are developed today because they could freely burn fossil fuels for 150, how much? 150 to 200 years. 150 to 200 years. So you see, you look at countries like, let's say, Canada, right? Canada, so Canada and US, European nations, even Russia and also Japan. So the reason why they are developed today is because they are able to freely burn fossil fuels to power their transportation sectors and to power their industries, right? So just one. Fine. So this is what we refer to as historical emissions. They are responsible for large part of climate change. So that has happened. So these developed industrialized nations and economies in transition, they are largely responsible for releasing greenhouse gases in large quantities since 150 years. Since 150 years. So whereas countries like, let's say, India or even China for that matter, so or Sri Lanka or small Pacific islands and small African nations. So they are not responsible for historical emissions, right? So these countries have been burning fossil fuels only in the last few decades. So today, India, China. So these might be the top emitters, India and China. So, but our emissions have increased only in the last 40 to 50 years. So why should these countries bear the burden for historical emissions? So this was always the question raised by developing nations and underdeveloped nations. So why should we be responsible for historical emissions? Because if we take up targets and if we try to bring down our emissions, that could compromise our economic growth, right? So for countries like India and even Bangladesh, right? Or let's say small Asian or African countries. So they cannot afford to invest immediately in cleaner technologies, right? And renewable energy. So that still need to depend on fossil fuels for some years because they have a bigger socio-economic concern, right? So these countries are poor countries. So they are dealing with poverty. They still have major social economic challenges. And the best way to overcome these challenges is through economic growth, and to power economic growth, you need fossil fuels you at least for some time. So that is why the developing nations and underdeveloped nations and also small island states, right? So they all came under the leadership of India and China during climate change negotiations, especially when this protocol was negotiated. So they pushed historical emissions and developed and industrialized nations. So climate change is a common goal. So no doubt every country has a common objective, right? So but the responsibilities has to be differentiated. Remember this word, right? Responsibilities has to be differentiated. So we can't take the same responsibility as US and as UK, as France, as Italy, right? So those countries are developed. What is the reason? Those countries are developed. So they have achieved their socio-economic goals. So they should be responsible for historical emissions. So they are the ones who released greenhouse gases in the last 150 years, right? So based on this principle, it was included into Kyoto Protocol, known as, I already told about CBDR. So that is common but differentiated responsibilities. So this is the very foundation of Kyoto Protocol. It provides for equitable, just wait. Equitable division of responsibilities based on the capacities of those countries and based on the historical responsibilities of those countries, right? So accordingly, industrialized nations, so developed nations and few economies in transition, few European Central Asian countries which had burned fossil fuels for at least few decades or at least 100 years. Right? So those were identified and they were made responsible for historical emissions and historical responsibilities. Right? So that is why this CBDR common but differentiated responsibilities. Right? So the convention placed these responsibilities on few countries and they had to follow these binding targets and they have to report periodically and submit themselves to periodic reviews and monitoring through the Climate Change Convention. So that is what is important, this Climate Change Convention. So that is what is important about this Kyoto Protocol, right? So it divided these countries through annex-based structure. Countries have been placed under different annexes based on their historical emissions and based on their historical responsibilities, right? You see, now if you look at this graph, you can clearly see the developed nations, right? And industrialized nations like US, European countries, Russia, Japan, they were responsible for historical emissions since the 1800s, from almost 1800s, right? So that is since the days of the Industrial Revolution. So in the last 150 odd years, these were the countries which reaped the benefits of burning of fossil fuels. So this is how they triggered their economic growth. So this is how they solved their socio-economic problems, but they ended up releasing greenhouse gases and causing global warming in climate change. So they are responsible for these historical emissions and they should take up more responsibilities, right? So now compare this with the emissions of countries like India or even Brazil, right? So developing nations and smaller underdeveloped countries, their contribution to historical emissions is negligible. So India and other countries like Brazil, we have been burning fossil fuels maybe in the last 40 to 50 years, right? So we should not be responsible for historical emissions. Okay, got it? So this is the argument that has been ingrained into Kyoto Protocol through the CBDR principle, right? So this is at the very heart of total protocol and common but differentiated responsibilities, right? You see Kyoto Protocol provisions. So under the Kyoto Protocol, countries were placed into different annexes. And Annex B, this Annex B countries listed under Annex B, right? So they were given a set of binding emission targets. So they had to reduce their emissions through clean technologies. Is that clean technologies and renewable energy? So around these 39 industrialized countries, developed nations, economies in transition, they were identified and they were given a set of binding emissions reduction targets. So that is, they have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as prescribed by Kyoto Protocol, right? So the target of this Kyoto Protocol was to reduce emissions by the 5%, right? 5% as compared to 1990 levels over a 5 years period between the 2008 to 2012, right? So this was the first period when this Kyoto Protocol actually implemented and enforced, right? So see, even though this was signed in year of 1997, so it was not implemented until 2008. Why? Because of the conflict between developing and developed nations. That is the reason. So for 1 decade, the conflict carried on, it went on. The provisions of the protocol, they were not strictly enforced or implemented for almost 1 decade. So the US in particular, it was blocking its implementation, and it eventually did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So finally, after several rounds of negotiation in the 2008, the first round of implementation was provided for, and Kyoto Protocol was implemented by, for 5 years, right? 5 years in the first commitment period, right? So during this period, more 30 industries, how many? 30 industrialized developed nations were placed under Annex B. So it's basically a list of countries, right? So these countries were given binding emissions targets, and they had to achieve and meet these targets, right? You see, this is the annex. Just 1 second, ma'am. So here, so in this graph, you can see the Annex B. Okay? Annex B countries, they include like, you see here, Australia and many European nations, countries like United States. So essentially, these are industrialized nations, developed nations, and a few economies in transition. So there is also something known as Annex 1, right? Annex 1 countries, so which are under Annex 1 list. So these countries, they accepted to take the responsibility. So it's more or less the same list under Annex 1. So there are a list of countries again, developed and industrialized nations, so which accepted to take binding targets, and the specific targets are mentioned under Annex B, right? So they have to invest in cleaner technologies, right? cleaner technologies and shift their economy from carbon-based economy, that is to clean economy. So the other nations developing under developed nations which have no binding targets. So they are called as non-annex. You see here, non-annex. So non-annex countries like India, China, Colombia, Israel, South Africa, Egypt, and also Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and also 140 countries, right? And other small countries you can think of, right? So most of these countries were placed under non-annex list. They did not have any binding targets, no targets on them. So whereas for Annex B countries, right? So we can accept it to take up the responsibility under Annex 1. So they were placed under Annex B and they were given a set of binding emission reduction targets, right? So why the Kyoto Protocol is so important? It clearly specified the target and the responsibilities and also put in place a review mechanism and a monitoring mechanism, right? So now this protocol was later amended in the year of 2012 through the Doha Amendment. So during this Doha Conference of Parties that was held in the year of 2012, a few changes were introduced in this Kyoto Protocol to extend its implementation for a second period between the 2013 and 2020. Okay, its implementation was extended by 7 more years after this 2012 because otherwise Kyoto Protocol would have expired, right? So we did not have any other climate change agreement. So but so at this Doha of parties, Kyoto Protocol was extended for the second period. That is, it was supposed to be implemented for 7 more years from this 2013 to 2020, right? So through these amendments, a few new commitments were placed on the Annex 1 countries, right? So the countries which had agreed to take additional responsibilities, they were given with just a few new targets and new commitments, and few new greenhouse gases were also to the list which had to be reported by the countries that were implementing these targets, right? So, but this kind, through this Doha Amendment, the overall target of Kyoto Protocol was raised, right? So, in the first commitment period, the global, it was to reduce emissions by 5%. How much? 5%, right? It has compared to the 1990 levels. So, but the second commitment period, the target was raised.
ये पूरा विलेज का बनाया है, जैसे यहाँ का विलेज में कैसे, गांव में कैसे काम करते हैं,
right? So 18% reduction in emissions as compared to 1990 levels during the second implementation period. So the overall target, it was raised from how much? 5%, right? 5% reduction to 18% reduction, right? So that's why this amendment is very, very significant, right? And Kyoto Protocol provided for several mechanisms to achieve these targets and to implement these targets. So under this protocol, the countries, that is Annex B countries, they primarily to meet their targets, right?
Yeah,
So through their national measures. So that is, they have to bring out few national laws and so that they can adopt cleaner technologies, right?
340.
Technologies. So they can move away from carbon and adopt cleaner forms of fuel, adopt solar wind and nuclear power if required. So, but the idea was to push them away from carbon-based industries and carbon-based agriculture, right? So the idea was to tackle deforestation and promote afforestation, right? Promote afforestation because forests are a natural carbon sinks. I already told about this natural carbon sinks, right? So any such measures, it could be taken up by these countries which were listed under Annex B. So it's up to them. They have to decide how they will achieve the targets, right? So every country, based on their historical emissions, they will be given an emission reduction targets. So they have to bring down their emissions year on year as per the given targets. And through their national laws and policies, they have to decide how they will reduce their emissions. For example, see, they can shut down coal-based power plants and switch to solar power, right? Coal-based power plant that is switched to solar power. So they can make their industrial processes more efficient. So they can make their vehicles transportation more efficient to reduce emissions, right? So they can switch to electric vehicles from fossil-based fuels. So through such national strategies, countries, those are supposed to achieve their targets. So apart from this Kyoto Protocol also provided for innovative mechanisms for carbon trading, and it created a carbon market as well, right? So it provided for every unique market-based mechanisms through which Annex B countries can achieve their targets, right? So mechanisms like international emissions trading, it was introduced through this. So a country, let's say Canada, for example, Canada, it has been given a target of how much? 50, right? 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide, right? So I'm just talking a hypothetical example here. So let's say Canada can't emit more than how much? 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide in a given year. That is the target given to Canada. So let's say US also, it has been given the same target. So, but United States might fail to implement the reduction measures and eventually based on its final reporting, its overall emissions for that year. It might be 53 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Okay. So US has breached its target exceeded to the emissions targeted by how much? 3. This 3 gigatons, right? So on the other hand, Canada. So Canada might have invested in cleaner technologies. So it might have invested in solar power, in cleaner fuels, cleaner technologies, and it might have brought down its emissions. And its overall emissions for that year, it might just be how much? 47 gigatons, right? So now that what Canada can do is it can monetize the remaining units. Right now, Canada has earned how much? 3, right? 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide. This can be converted into trading units, that is carbon trading units, known as CER, carbon trading units, right? So it stands for carbon emission reduction. So that is certified emission reduction. It is a certified emission reduction. It is a certificate, right? So that certified that this country has saved this number of emissions, these units of emissions. Those certified units, it can be traded in the carbon market, right? So it is similar to how you trade your financial instruments and financial derivative instruments, right? So just like we trade in gold or bonds or in commodities. So similarly, a country which had achieved the target and it had earned certified emission reduction or carbon credit, right? So I already told about that carbon credit, CC, right? So this carbon credit could be sold or traded to other countries which had breached their targets, right? So the US, in this example, we have taken US which has breached the target can purchase the carbon credit units from Canada, right? So Canada will earn money through that revenue, through that, right? And Canada will incentivize to shift to cleaner technologies, right? Cleaner technologies. And countries like US, which are breaching the target, can pay for the contribution. So they are making to climate change, and that will be disincentive for them, right? So that they will be pushed to invest in cleaner technologies. So the idea was to push countries to reduce emissions around the world, right? Because emissions, if it reduces in Canada or US, does not really matter. At the end of the day, that there is one side of the argument, right? So one sector, one side of the argument, they support this market-based mechanism, because if countries are breaching their targets, they can pay for it. So that creates a disincentive and pushes them to invest in cleaner technologies, right? So overall, at the global level, there will be reduction of emissions. So market-based mechanism were created, but there has been a lot of criticism against this as well, because it allows way for developed nations to breach their targets. So countries, they may not care about their targets. They simply might breach them, pay money for that, and purchase carbon credits from other countries, right? So that is the reason. So which have actually achieved emission reductions, right? So that will not really help the goal of climate change. And this is the criticism against the market-based carbon trading mechanism, right? So it also provided for clean developed mechanism, right? Clean developed mechanism. So that is called CDM. So through which the Annex B countries, so that is countries which are developed, industrialized, which have been given binding targets. So they can fund clean, right? Fund clean projects. Fund clean projects in developing nations in non-annexed countries. Non-annexed countries, not Annex B, okay? So even for this, they will earn carbon credits. So for example, let's say France. So France can fund a solar project in India. Remember this. So India is a non-annexed country, right? So France will be earn carbon credits and it can sell that in the carbon trading market, right? So next, another mechanism called as, you see, joint implementation. JI, that is called JI. So it was created. So through which Annex B countries can collaborate. So that is second developed nations can work together and help each other. So each other to achieve their targets. So let's say, for example, UK can collaborate with Canada, right? So UK can fund a clean project in Canada and UK will earn carbon credit, which can be used to meet its national targets. So such a target-based and market-based mechanisms. So this was created through the Kyoto Protocol. What is that? Target-based and market-based mechanism, right? So many trading mechanisms were created like emissions trading, clean development mechanism, and this joint implementation. Okay? So, to ensure that the countries are meeting the targets through review and monitoring mechanism was put in place, right? So this is the best part about Kyoto Protocol. It is the review and monitoring mechanism was put in place to ensure that Annex B countries, these are meeting their targets, right? So they have to report on their progress. They have to provide periodic reports to Climate Change Convention. That is to show that they are complying with the given targets. So if they are breaching the targets, they have to purchase carbon credits, right? Carbon credits from where? Other countries which have actually achieved a reduction in emissions, right? So such a monitoring mechanism it was put in place, and even an adaptation fund was provided to provide funding for developing nations and underdeveloped nations, right? So adaptation fund was set up through which climate finance could be generated, right? So through which developed nations and Annex B, right? Annex B countries will pull their money. So their resources together and financial assistance could be provided through this adaptation fund, right? So that the most threatened countries can take adaptation measures, and low-lying countries, especially Maldives and Pacific Island states, countries like Bangladesh, right? So these countries are very vulnerable to climate change and rise in sea levels, right? So they would receive assistance to the adaptation fund, and they can take adaptation measures to protect themselves against the threats posed by climate change. Right? This climate change. So, these were the important features and provisions of Kyoto Protocol, and it was implemented in 2 different periods, right? So, as of now, this Kyoto Protocol is no longer in place. Why? Because it was replaced in the year of 2015. 2015 through the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement became the second binding agreement under the Climate Change Convention, right? So currently this Paris Agreement is the primary climate change treaty, right? So it essentially replaced the Kyoto Protocol, right? But nevertheless, many countries followed their commitments until 2020, and that's why Kyoto Protocol is very, very important, right? So this is the Kyoto Protocol, right? So any doubts in this Kyoto Protocol? Okay, so I can stop right now. So my voice is very low and I have some pain in my throat. Any doubts? Nubia, Purgesh, Dalia, Bhargavi, Sravana Datta, Ucha, class 3.
I'm Dalia.
Yes. So any doubts in this Kyoto Protocol?
No, ma'am.
It's okay. So can I stop here? I have pain in my throat. Okay, I have some infection. That's why my voice
Yes,
is.
ma'am, your voice is pura choked at the miss, ma'am. I understand.
So that is the main reason. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
So I can stop today classes. Okay, I can't take one more. Okay. If possible, I will take the class tomorrow evening, 6:30 or 7. Okay?
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Bye.